All right. Does the microphone work? Can you guys hear me in the back? Great. We're all good. All right. Let's go ahead and get started in the interest of everybody's time. My name is Jill Stacy. I work actually for the Colorado Department of Education. I am their data privacy analyst. I specialize somewhat in data privacy and data privacy language and contracts specifically. So I've worked with Whitney a lot, and she asked me to help her out with these things.
They might not know me.
Okay, Whitney Phillips is the Chief Privacy Officer for the Utah State Board. So what I've done is I've put together this training. We've put together some materials to help you out. We have some things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But hopefully this is useful to you guys. Hopefully that you'll get something out of this. And if you ever have any questions, if you want to stop me, feel free to do so. I'm happy to make this more of a discussion than it is a lecture. So let's hope it's not too terribly boring. I'd like to find out kind of who you guys are and what you guys do. So are you guys with the LEA? LEAs? Oh, look like most of them. Lawyers? A few. IT? Administrator people? Other? Okay, so hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion here. What we're going to go over is we're going to focus mostly on data privacy and security terms and contracts. I'll have a few other contractual language in here, but that's not really my area of expertise. I kind of leave that up to the lawyers. So what we're going to have is mostly a focus on IT and security. If you have any questions, as I said, feel free to stop me, but we'll go through this. So basically, I want to help you guys understand more about contracts, how to use them, what benefits that they will have. I want you to understand what your legal requirements are under data privacy laws, both in terms of Utah's laws and federal and state laws. We're going to talk about contract templates that I have developed for you guys, and a menu that I have developed that will sort of show you more information about certain different terms you can use and why. And then I'm here to answer your questions, provide you additional resources, basically here to be a resource to you guys. So. Some of this is kind of elementary, but we'll go ahead and go through it anyway. A contract is really important whenever you're dealing with an exchange of just about anything. You really need it if you're exchanging money, but if you're exchanging data, it's also very, very important because you want each party to clearly understand their obligations. Mostly, though, it's backup for when things go wrong, and some things can go wrong. And in terms of PII, things can go very, very wrong. So if I use the term PII, do you guys know what that means? Mostly yeses. Okay, cool. So we'll go through. As I mentioned, as part of this work, I have developed templates, contract templates that you can use. However, you should know they're completely optional for you to use. You can use them, you cannot. You can take bits and pieces from them, you cannot. These are for you to use and for you to customize to make them work for you. Not how they work for me, not how they work for Whitney. You don't, even if something is listed as required in the menu and in the contract, that means that it's legally required, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to use that exact language either. So basically, these are a place for you to start from. Work with your legal staff, work with all those people that you work with in order to develop a contract that works for you. So there's just one more thing I want to say here. Little fine print. I'm not actually a lawyer. I've never been a lawyer. I've never went to law school. What I have done is negotiate these contracts for about 12 years. So I've negotiated hundreds of contracts where I negotiate the data privacy and security terms. I have gotten pretty good at it. I've negotiated with Google. I've negotiated with big name companies. So I have a really good list of contract terms that have worked for me in the past. So these have been tested, these have been gone through all the various different scenarios, and they're actually pretty well established as working when you work with vendors. So hopefully as part of this, I'll also provide you with a kind of a viewpoint on what vendors tend to say about these things. How much do they push back on this? How many times do they complain about this term or that term? So hopefully that will give you not just an understanding of what language you might want to use, but how to use it and use it successfully. So let's go back. All right, so this is some basic good rules of thumb for contracts. If you don't put anything, if anything's not actually included in the contract itself, it's up for debate. It's up for dispute. And if it's not stated very, very clearly, that can also lead to disputes, because what you might think is one thing is probably not the exact same thing I'm thinking. So you may have an assumption on what delete means. That's probably not the same assumption that I have. So that's why it's very important to spell things out very clearly, very specifically, and make sure that all parties understand what everything means. You need to document each responsibility. Don't make assumptions on what everybody knows. You need to make sure that it's very, very clear. So, for example, if you guys can read this, the contractor shall develop the state's FY15 annual report based on the FY14 annual report within 10 working days of the beginning of the legislative session. Now, that seems pretty specific, right? What assumptions are being made in this language? What things that are being written that somebody's going to assume that somebody else knows? You guys have any ideas?
When the legislative session.
Good. Exactly. It doesn't say when the legislative session is going to have to end. And if it was Utah's, I have no idea when your legislative session ends. What other assumptions? What about the fiscal year? Does everybody know exactly when the fiscal year starts and ends? Do you know what was in the prior annual report? Probably not. So this can kind of show that while it seems to be pretty clear language, in the end, there's a lot that's being assumed here. And if you're not clear and the vendor's not clear, you're going to be operating under different assumptions. Make sense? Yeah? Yeah? Cool. All right. So the other important thing that's very, very important is accuracy. You need to describe exactly what you want and exactly how you want it to be. So you're buying a car and you want to buy this car. Describe this to me as you would. Camaro, thank you. I'm not a car person.
Yellow with black racing stripes.
Yellow with black racing stripes.
Convertible.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Nice wheels. Yes. Yes. So, how many of those descriptors that you used would also describe this? A lot of them. And if you just paid, what, $45,000 or whatever that thing costs, and you got this, that's not good. You'd be pretty pissed. So, it's not necessarily to say that you'll understand every single thing or have the ability to describe it in such detail. But this kind of shows you how things could be differently interpreted. So it's important to walk it through. I always pretend I'm talking to a particularly slow 3-year-old. And if I can explain it to them, I can explain it to everybody. One of the things we'll go over is definitions. And you might think that this is like just the dictionary definitions, and it's not quite that simple. You need to describe or define anything that's somewhat different from the dictionary definition. So, for example, I was talking about delete earlier. My definition for delete is not what you'd find in the dictionary. So, how would a vendor know what I'm talking about when I talk about delete? So that's kind of very important for you guys to understand. Anything that's jargon, anything that's specific to Utah, anything that's specific to education. Those are all very important things to define, because the minute you stop defining things and just assuming that people know, there's a lot of area for dispute. Once you do define things, capitalize them throughout the entire agreement, and don't duplicate definitions, and also don't use two different terms for the same thing. So in this example here, contractor shall limit access to PII to authorized persons only. Vendor shall require a non-disclosure agreement to be signed by all authorized users prior to be granted access to data. So does that have what it should have? Are there any terms that are like the same thing but using different words? Yeah? Do you guys have suggestions on how to change this to make it a little bit more clear?
We've got authorized persons and authorized users. Make those consistent.
Great, great,
Contractor and vendor.
great, great,
Data and PII.
great, perfect. Yes, exactly. So that can show you how it's very important for you to make sure everything's consistent throughout the entire contract. Here's another good rule of thumb, too. When you're saying what somebody should do, you should make it very clear if they're required to do it, if they just should do it or can do it, and if there's certain obligations that are listed in the contract but that don't actually have to be followed, or that neither party has to confirm has happened. So, for example, contractor shall. Everything that starts with contractor shall or LEA shall is an obligation in the contract. When you're going through to determine if the contract has been fulfilled, those are the check marks you give. May is something that can be done, but is not required. And will is for when something that's going to happen to kick off something else. So, for example, you're giving me a report, and I am going to confirm that the report is accurate. I don't have to confirm that the report is accurate. It's in my best interest. But you don't have to sit down and make sure that I do that. So we can write the LEA will review the report. It just means that we're going to agree that that might happen, but you don't have to sit down and make sure I do it. Make sense? It's kind of a little odd. Okay. And then organization is very, very key. If people have to search through the contract to figure out what this applies to, and if there's a security requirement over here and then one down here, it just makes everything far more complicated. Also, if you keep your contracts as consistent as possible across different templates, it makes it easier on you, frankly. A lot of this is about making things easier on you, so you don't have to rewrite a negotiated contract, so that you can improve them over time. Basically, making sure everything's in the right place will help you in the long run. Okay? Any questions about that before we move on to more of the nuts and bolts and other stuff? Okay. So, as I mentioned, we put together some documents that you'll get at the end of this session. We'll make sure that you get them via email. We'll have a sign-up sheet, so make sure that you sign up at some point, and then we'll make sure that you guys get copies of all these documents. As I mentioned before, these are optional. You don't have to use them. You don't have to use them as written. You can amend them to make it work for you. What I put together is basically a menu of terms that are related directly to privacy and security. So these will have all your legal obligations and a few other things that I generally recommend. It will tell you if they're recommended or not, or if they're required by law and why. It will give you the legal reference, if applicable. It'll tell you kind of where in the contract that needs to go. And then it'll have some guidance next to it. And as I was talking earlier, I've negotiated a lot of these contracts. So a lot of times I know what the vendors like and don't like. So that's usually contained over here. You'll get this, and you can feel free to use it as much or as little as you like. It's completely there for you as a resource. Okay. The other thing I'll be providing you guys is sort of a contract template. So it takes all those things from the menu, throws in a few extra things, and kind of puts it all together in a package. I find that one of the things I'm always struggle with is how to connect everything. I know that this term needs to be there, but I don't necessarily know how this term is going to relate to that term and that term. So hopefully this template will provide you with all the things you need. Yeah. So this is the cover page. It's best to put everything that's factual about the contract here. Who the parties are, what the contract's about, kind of at a high level, how much it's for, are there attachments that go with it, and everything else that you might want to be able to find out in a quick glance. It helps to have this as organized as possible so that if you have to go through like 50, 60 contracts that you have, you can easily just look at the front page and find out everything you need to know. Having the start and end date, having contract contacts, all that kind of stuff is very, very important to put into this section. This is completely up to you, what you want to put in here. This is modeled on the USBE's contract terms and how they have set things up. But again, make this work for you. So I'll have a whole bunch of different sections in this, and I'll have LEA. That's basically a placeholder for whatever LEA that you belong to. So whenever I say LEA, just assume I'm talking about your LEA. Okay. So now we're going to go through the contract as it is written. The header is the next item you want to work on. And it basically just identifies the parties. And it identifies any nicknames. So you don't want to write out the exact name of your entire school district every single time. So you're going to give it a nickname. So for this, I use the Utah Awesome School District as my placeholder. And I'm going to call them Awesome Schools for the rest of this presentation. The contractor is generally defined in that header section. Let's go back a second in the cover page. So here's where we have the name, address, and all that information about the contractor. But we say that this person is going to be defined throughout the contract as contractor. Now that doesn't necessarily have to be the word you use. You can use contractor, you can use vendor, you can use the name of the entity or a code or an acronym of the entity, like USBE instead of Utah State Board of Education. You can use researcher if you're using a researcher. You can use agency if it's another state agency. It's basically up to you to use whatever you want to use. This term is, however, embedded throughout the entire contract, so it's good for you to pick one that will work for the biggest group of people. So if you want to have one term that you use for all your vendors, contractor, that way you don't have to amend this template every single time you get a new person that you're working with. Contractors will suffice for all your service providers. Questions about that? Another good thing to do is to define everybody as either a party or together the parties. You don't want to write in a contract, LEA and Frogs R Us are both going to do this. You can just simplify that by saying the parties agree or the parties will do this. That way it'll make it easier for you to just make the contract as short and concise as possible. Make sense? All right, so this is a section where I don't tend to use it very often. I tend to go straight into the contract terms like a demon. This is the whereas section. It's also sometimes called the recitals. It basically just talks about the contract as a big picture idea. I usually recommend to not put any specific requirements in the whereas. You're just sort of setting the stage. You kind of discuss why this contract exists in the first place. What services are being provided? Talk about the fact that this contract involves the transfer of PII. Talk about maybe some laws that this contract needs to comply with, and a few other things. This is completely up to you, but this is where you can put in that information that's good to have in the contract, but is not an actual direct obligation for any of the parties. And I'm using Frogs R Us as this because I like frogs. So we're going to provide frogs to all the students, even if they don't want one. All right, now we're going to get into definitions, and these are going to be pretty specific to just data privacy and security. That's kind of my area of expertise, so that we're going to focus on that. Any questions about general things before we move into definitions? Yeah? No? Cool. All right, so the first thing that's very important, and we showed you this in one of the examples, is the idea of an authorized person. You want to make sure, and this is both a privacy best practice and a requirement in most laws, only people who are authorized to see PII should be able to see it. That means if I'm sending data to a whole entire corporation, it doesn't mean that everybody in that corporation should be able to see it, period. Only people who have a direct need to know in order to provide the services explained in this contract should be able to access that information. Now, we're also going to have some obligations for these authorized persons. So we're going to define them. Basically, they need to have a legitimate educational purpose to see the data. And they're going to have certain responsibilities to fulfill as part of that contract. And we'll get into those in a little bit. Questions about authorized persons? One thing you should also note, and we'll get into this in a little bit, just because you're an authorized person, authorized to see the PII that I'm going to send you, doesn't mean you can use it for any purpose you want. You can only use that for authorized purposes too. So if I send you data and you are there to put it into a statewide information system, ASIS, that doesn't mean that you can look up your neighbor's kid to find out how they're doing on their tests. That's not an authorized purpose. That's you just being a little nosy. So that's very important to understand. It's just because you're an authorized person doesn't mean you can access all the data, and it doesn't mean you can access it for any particular purpose. Okay? Okay, so destroy. I tend to use the word destroy. Your law requires you to delete the data. Now, you can choose what word you want to use. I like destroy because it sounds far more permanent and official than delete. You know, I can delete something by just hitting the delete key or, backspace. That doesn't necessarily mean that the data is gone. I want it to be much more gone. I want it to be permanently irretrievable. You have to do something really, really complex in order to get to this data again after it's been destroyed. So here's a couple of options you can use. It's totally up to you. Again, you can use these. You can use one of these two. You can create your own. It's up to you. One of them basically just says that you're going to destroy it so that it's not maintained in a retrievable form, and it cannot be retrieved in the normal course of business. So security people always tell you that nothing is ever completely deleted, ever. There's always a way to recover information, unless you actually need it, in which case you can never recover it. But I want you to have to work really hard to do that. However, as I mentioned before, your idea of destroy or delete may not be the same as mine. There are industry standards. You guys know what NIST is? IT guys probably know. Okay, it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's a federal, maybe even international standard that lists basically not just what to do, but how to do it. I like referring people to this so that there is no confusion about what I mean by destroy. It's very specific. It tells you exactly what to do, and it just removes any potential confusion. But again, it's up to you. All right. So now, incidents. Incidents will happen. They will always happen. No matter what you do, no matter how great your security is, no matter how much you try to prevent them, breaches and incidents will happen. So it's very important for you to understand what to do and for your vendors to understand what to do in the case of an incident. So now, there's two different words that I'll be talking about here, and they have very different meanings, and I use them very strategically. So there's incident, and then there's breach. A good way to think about it is that an incident is the potential of something happened. Or something happened, but it may not actually lead to the loss or misuse of PII. So, for example, sending email to the wrong person that has PII in it. That could be an incident. Somebody trying to attack your systems. Incident. You accidentally download a virus. Incident. I generally do not call it a breach until I know that the data is out there and I can't control it, or that I know that somebody has ill intent and is going to use it for a bad purpose. So, for example, in that situation where I was talking about, I'm sitting down, I'm emailing a spreadsheet full of PII to a colleague. I type in the name, I do the autofill, and it comes up with the wrong person's name, and I send it. Now, that's an incident, because that person should not have received that information. However, I get on the phone immediately, and I'm like, I sent you this spreadsheet. I shouldn't have sent it to you. Really sorry. Please delete it and make sure it's completely removed from your computer. I then maybe ask them to send me confirmation in email saying, yes, I've deleted it and I won't use it for any other purpose. You pretty much contained it. Not 100%, not in any abundance of doubt, but you've contained it to the best of your ability. I would consider that to be still an incident and not a breach. However, if I sent it out to 300 people, and I don't really even know who exactly they are, or if it was posted on the internet and it was posted for like 3 weeks before I found out about it, I can't necessarily control where the data has gone, or even really know where the data has gone. That's probably more of a breach. Questions about that? There's a reason why I use incident in our contracts instead of breach. I want to be the one who says the B word, period. That's going to be my responsibility. Because once I say that we've had a breach, there may be some legal obligations I have to fulfill. I may have to provide notice. I may have to do it within a certain time frame. So it's very important for me to only define a breach as something that has actually been a breach. If we start using the B word for every incident, we're going to be constantly working on things. I don't want my vendors to define that either. I don't want them to call me up and said, we had a breach. I want them to say, we had an incident, here's what happens. And if I determine it was a breach, it is a breach. Make sense? You guys should have all the responsibility for handling this. Kind of sucks because you have all the responsibility, but that's the only way to make sure that you're handling these things in the way you need to and protecting yourselves and your district. I also like to make this definition. A lot of times I talk about being specific in definitions and how it's very advisable to be as specific as possible, unless you shouldn't. I want this to be as broad as possible. I want them to call me 24 hours, 7 days a week, either me or somebody else, for anything that they suspect might be an incident or might be a breach. I don't want them to think about it. I don't want them to debate whether or not something actually happened. I want them to inform me as soon as possible. It is better if they say, we had an incident, we're working on it, here's what happened, and have it turn out to be nothing, than having them not inform me of something that turns out to be a major breach. So I'd rather be bugged all the time than not bugged at all. Make sense? Okay. Metadata. One of the things that I find most in negotiating contracts is that everybody's understanding of what PII is completely different. Parents tend to think that anything that has ever been associated with their child ever in the history of time is PII. Vendors seem to think that PII is only two things. It's convenient for both parties to think that way. I don't want to be confused about this, so I want to talk about the data that goes behind the other data. This is kind of information that may not seem to be personally identifiable, but that when combined and when used in a particular way could be PII. Now, it's completely up to you if you want to include this definition in there. This is defined in your law, so that's important to know. But again, it's completely up to you. The reason why people get all upset about metadata is that this is generally what is collected in terms of behavioral tracking. And that can sometimes lead to behavioral advertising. So this is how you use things. Like I went from this website to that website, I looked at that page, and I went back to this page. That's stuff that's commonly collected. It may not be personally identifiable to me. It may not have my IP address, or it may, but I still want to control that. And I really want to control that for the student data that I'm sending to a third party. The one thing you should remember throughout all of this is that these are not necessarily the standards I follow in my day-to-day life. I'm way too loosey-goosey with my own data. I'm the worst. I never read the terms of use. I never read the privacy policy. It's terrible, but I'm taking that risk for me. I'm not taking that risk for the students that I'm working with. I'm not taking that risk for the teachers that I employ. So hold yourself to a higher standard because you're protecting them. All right, so okay, there we go. Student PII. Now, this is one definition, but there's pretty much a different definition for student PII depending on what law you're looking at. This definition sort of maps to both Utah law and FERPA. So it's kind of a good catch-all. This is another section where I like to be as broad as possible, which is, counter to whatever I tell you. But I'd rather have a vendor think that something's PII and protect it accordingly, rather than think that it's excluded from that definition and do whatever they want with it. So I sometimes have this definition be way broader than state law or federal law. It's totally up to me. And, I have to get the vendor to agree to it. But for the most part, I don't usually receive too much pushback on this. The one thing you'll want to know is that you'll have like this definition from this law here and this definition from this law here. You can choose to combine them. You can choose which one, but always go with the broadest. That way you're covered for anything. Make sense? Okay? So now, PII is kind of why I'm here. That's kind of what we talk about the most when we talk about things. But that may not be only the data or information that you're sending to a third party. So you might want to include a few other definitions. So for example, I also have contracts in place for educator data. Now, educator data is not really protected in laws. You might have a few state laws. We have a few, but they don't really protect much of anything. And that's pretty concerning to me because in some cases, depending on what you collect, educator data can actually be more sensitive. For example, we collect educator social security numbers. We don't collect students' social security numbers. A social security number is sensitive, and I want to protect that. So we only have a major law, data privacy law for student data, but we have determined as an agency to apply the privacy protections and security protections pretty close to evenly between the two different types of data. Where it doesn't make sense, we don't do it. So, for example, we're not going to ask an educator's parent to give permission for certain uses. I mean, we might ask them, but we don't have to follow them word for word. But we do try to protect the data as much as possible. So I sometimes have educator-only contracts, sometimes have student data-only contracts. Sometimes I have them combined if we're sending both of them. If you want to send them combined, you might want to have a separate definition that includes both of them. So for example, data includes both of those things. So I don't have to write student data and educator data. I can just write data. Make sense? Confidential information is another one that I like to define. That's stuff that's not identifiable, personally identifiable, but it's also stuff that I don't want everybody and their cousin to know. It's a little different being a public entity. Sometimes you just don't get to have trade secrets or proprietary information, but I like to define it anyway. So that's stuff about the business that is confidential to the business. May not be applicable to you guys as public entities, but it's also a good thing to define. I tend to have, and Colorado Department of Education tends to have two major differentiations between our contracts. We have everything with PII and everything without PII. Everything without PII, we always include some confidentiality language around the use of confidential information. But it's like 4 paragraphs. Very short, to the point. Our PII contracts, pages and pages and pages. But that way it makes it very easy to say, if you are negotiating a contract that does not involve PI, don't call me. I don't care. But if you do, you need to call me, and I need to be involved. And I do this with everyone. If I send PII to anyone outside of our organization, I have a contract. It's supported by our state law, which is helpful, but I do that anyway, and I've always done that with all the different places where I've worked. Because I feel like even if you're only required to have contracts in place with this particular type of entity, the PI doesn't care. A data breach doesn't care. It will follow the data. And so you probably should have a contract for those two. Make sense? Are there any other definitions of data that you might want to put in here? Definitions of information? You got everything covered? Yeah? Staff? Do you have staff contracts that deal with yours, or would you consider those educators?
We separate them.
Okay.
Separate faculty versus staff.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's another way that you need to make these work for you. If you want to have those two definitions, have at it. Just make sure it's clear and that you and the vendor understand. All right. I talk really fast, sorry. So there's a few other definitions that you will want to include. Targeted advertising. Now this is prohibited in your law, so it's really important to make sure that everybody understands what that means. And this definition is pretty closely tied to what is the definition in the law. There are some cases in the law where you're permitted to do targeted advertising. You can include those in your contract or not. It's up to you. I like to include them because then I don't have to have another discussion with the vendor about, well, I kind of do just customized learning. Is that okay? Yeah, actually, under the terms of the law, that's okay. Instead of having to have those back and forth conversations, I just put in the law saying, yes, you can do customized learning. One other thing that is slightly different, advertising to a student or to a student's parents. Honestly, a lot of advertising doesn't really go to the student. It mostly goes to the parent. So that's something you want to make sure is very clear. That if you're using student PII for advertising, it doesn't matter who you're sending that advertising to, don't do it. Unless you have an exception that is covered in law. Make sense? Subcontractors. This is where things get incredibly complicated, incredibly fast. Almost every single vendor you will ever do business with has subcontractors. Sometimes those subcontractors work behind the scenes and don't have access to PII. Sometimes they do. So you don't need to worry about your vendor's plumbers who come in to fix the pipes. Doesn't matter. But if they come in to service their databases where all the student PII is held, you want to make sure that either they can't see the data or that they'll protect it accordingly. So generally, if I have a requirement for a vendor, I want them to flow that down to their subcontractors. If I'm expecting my vendors to do something, the subcontractors should do it too. Make sense? Yeah. It can get very, very complicated, especially in today's world where the use of cloud technology is getting more and more prevalent. So I have a lot of really strict requirements saying that you must flow down contractually all these requirements to your subcontractors. Almost every vendor I do business with these days say, well, we use AWS, Amazon Web Services, for our cloud hosting, and we can't tell them what to do. So for the most cases, I'm like, okay, let's talk about how you secure that data in the cloud and how we can control it that way. Because I know that they're not going to get a contract in place with Amazon that differs from Amazon standard terms, and I don't really expect them to. I don't expect more than vendors can reasonably do, for the most part. I hold them to a high standard, but it's not an impossible standard. So this may require some discussion with your vendors about how far they can flow the requirements of the contract down within a reasonable way. Okay? Okay, so do we want to break? Keep going? Take a 5-minute? We're doing really great on time, so feel free to do what you like, but I don't see a whole lot of nodding heads, so we'll go ahead and continue. Now we're going to get away from the definitions into more of the specific requirements. And again, these are mostly related to data privacy and security. We already talked about authorized users. Now we're going to talk about what those authorized users can and cannot do, and what people who are not authorized users can do. So basically, actually, no, I'm sorry, I lied. These are actually just general provisions, but this one talks about access to data. But this doesn't talk about how a vendor's staff can access the data. This is about how you can access your data when it's being held by a vendor. So FERPA requires you to respond to a parent request for access to PII and correction if it's factually inaccurate. If this information is being held by the vendor or is collected directly from the student by a vendor, you're going to need their assistance to comply with FERPA. So you want to make sure that you can access that information if you need to. So basically, this basically just says that you can use established operational services to access and retrieve PII stored on the contractor systems. Now, I have vendors who are like, what does this mean? I'm not going to set up a specific pathway for you to access our systems. That's insecure, and it actually will put the threat of other people's PII to risk. I totally agree with that. That means that they're actually thinking this stuff through. And I usually am really thrilled to hear that. I want to use established operational services. So that means if I need an administrator login to access all the information on the system, that's all I mean. You don't have to go through this huge complex process to grant me this access. Just whatever you have in place. But if you have no way for me to access the information, that's one of those things that throw up a few red flags. They should have some way for you to access the information, period. A lot of the stuff that I tell you to put in these contracts starts conversations that may lead you to understand more about how the vendor uses data. Sometimes you'll find out things that the vendor was not necessarily going to disclose to you. So this is really good to make sure that they're doing what they should be doing with the data. Make sense? Any questions on everything I've gone through for it yet? Are we keeping up to speed? Falling asleep? Very, very bored? Yeah. This is the driest material I present, I swear. It's not fun, but I love it, which is weird. School officials. So, in order to break up the monotony, let's watch a short little video. So my BFFs here at the Utah Board of Education put together, let's see if I can make this work.
How many of you have seen this?
Okay.
Is the star here? Is it?
All right. Technical difficulties, please stand by. Are we going to work? Okay, cool. There we go. All right. Oh, I don't know if I have sound. What the heck? Come on. Oh, for heaven's sakes. All right, maybe we won't have a video. Yeah, it's resume. Okay. Huh?
FERPA exceptions. We're about to deep dive into FERPA exceptions. But before we do, let's do a quick recap of FERPA law so that we understand why these exceptions exist. FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, grants three main rights to parents of minors and students who have turned 18. First, they have the right to access their students' educational records. Second, they have the right to seek to amend those educational records. Third, they have the right to consent to disclose their students' personally identifiable information. This last one about the right to consent to disclose information is where FERPA exceptions come into play. As an LEA, or local educational agency, you have a lot of student information, also known as PII, personally identifiable information. Are we done with the acronyms? Oh, we are. Good. You're entrusted with this student information, and so you should only share it with others with written parental consent or by using one or more of the FERPA exceptions. Exceptions. Times where you can share student PII without parental consent. There are several FERPA exceptions, but we're going to focus right now on some of the main ones. Auditor evaluation, school official, directory information, and studies. Let's talk about each of these in detail. Audit or evaluation. Politicians, am I right? First, they mandate that you follow a certain program, and then they ask for data to verify the effectiveness of said program. Almost like they think they're the government or something. This exception refers specifically to the audit or evaluation of a federal or state-supported education program, or to enforce or comply with federal legal requirements related to that program, whether they give you money or not. Then they may have to give some access to student PII if the mandate requires it for the purpose of audit or evaluation. But let me let you in on a little secret. The state or federal government doesn't have to initiate the audit or evaluation. You can do it yourself, so long as it's of a state or federal program. But just a reminder, it's only for the state you live in and for the federal government that you're accountable to. If China calls you up on the phone, you don't have to give them anything. We'll never make that mistake again. Similar to other exceptions with FERPA, there are some requirements for sharing the data correctly. First, the entity receiving the data has to be either a state or local educational authority or the authorized representative of such an authority. Second, a written agreement has to be in place that ensures that the data are only used for the authorized purpose. That means there has to be protections against unauthorized redisclosure. And the receiving entity also has to destroy the data once it is no longer needed for the audit or evaluation. Here's an example for you. Say you're receiving funds from the federal government for running Title I programs. In this case, you may enter into a written agreement with an authorized representative to share the PII with them for the purpose of an audit or evaluation without written parental consent. So remember, if there's no federal or state requirement, then you wouldn't use this exception. Oh, that's so good. Studies exception. Has this ever happened to you? Hello, who is this? Oh, hi, Bob, the researcher. How's the family? Are you publishing or perishing, Bob? What's that? You're interested in some educational data about that product our students are using? Oh, yes, Bob, we would love to give you so much student personally identifiable information. Does FERPA allow this? You should never give student personally identifiable information to a researcher just because they ask, even if they say please. If an LEA wants to have a study done, they can contract with a researcher and even share student personally identifiable information without written parental consent using the studies exception. That is, provided a few conditions are met. The study must be done for or on the educational entity's behalf and for an educational purpose. FERPA specifically mentions... How did you do that? That was magic. FERPA specifically mentions 3 purposes. 1, to develop, validate, or administer predictive tests. 2, to administer student aid programs. 3, to improve instruction. The data can only be shared with a written agreement in place that specifies the purpose, scope, and duration of the study, what data are to be shared, that the data shared can only be used for the purposes of the study. They can't be using that data for some other side research they got. It's not for you. They can't do it. And that the data must be destroyed at the request of the educational entity or after the study is done. For example, let's say your district is invested in some reading software, and you want to know just how effective that reading software is. Now, the reading software isn't a part of a federal or state mandate, so the audit or evaluation exception would not apply. But the studies exception would, since the purpose is to improve instruction. You could contract with a local researcher, perhaps at, I don't know, a university, and create a written agreement for sharing that data. And remember, researcher calls you, you call the researcher, doesn't matter. Question is it for or on your behalf? For your behalf or on your behalf? That is the question. Directory information. You know, sometimes I like to break out the old yearbook and reminisce about the good old days. That guy still owes me money. Oh no. Oh no. Student pictures. Student names. Participation in officially recognized sports and activities. This is all PII. But Yearbooks like this are actually okay, thanks to the FERPA Directory Information Exception. Directory information is information about a student that generally wouldn't be considered harmful or an invasion of privacy if disclosed. Examples might include a student's name, gender, birthday, picture, or many others. Now, there are many situations where a school might want to make this information public, such as a playbill for the school play, the names, height, and weight of an athlete in a sporting event, a list of student names for Valentine's Day, or photos in a school yearbook. You get the idea. Directory information has no requirement for the school to control the information once it's been shared. Once it's out there, it's out there. It's important to remember that directory information, it's going to be different from one LEA to another LEA. It's even going to be different from one school to another school within the same LEA. And that's because each LEA and school gets to decide what they have designated as directory information. Now that you know what it is, here are the rules. Rule number 1, don't feed your directory information after midnight. Wait, what's that? That's the plot of Gremlins? What about the water stuff? Okay, that's also Gremlins. Okay, my mistake. Rule number 1, educational entities must provide parents with an annual notification of what types of data they have designated as directory information. Note that FERPA allows you to go beyond this and have a limited directory information policy, where you would indicate specifically who you'll be sharing the data with and for what purposes. Either way, parents must be given the option to opt out of directory information being shared. And the annual notice needs to include the time frame that parents have to opt out. But that means that if a parent has opted their student out of directory information, then they shouldn't appear in any publications that use directory information, like a yearbook. Sorry, Sally, you'll just be known as no photo available till the end of time. This will require that LEAs and schools have some sort of way of tracking opt-outs to ensure that student data are being shared correctly. Because of these opt-outs, there are many situations where you may be sharing essentially directory information, but you may not want to use that exception. For example, an online educational app might only require a student's name to create an account. Harmless, right? But if the parents have opted out, then the student wouldn't be able to use that app in class. That's why for educational apps, you'll most likely want to use the school official exception and not directory information. So, to summarize, annual notification, allow the parents the option to opt out. But you don't have to take my word for it. Just take a look. It's in a book. A reading rainbow. School official! School officials includes teachers and other individuals working within an educational agency that have a legitimate educational interest in the student. Please note that just because someone's a teacher, it doesn't mean they have a legitimate educational interest. Gossiping or venting about students in the faculty lounge would not fall under this exception. Hey, you know Johnny in my third period class? You know the one with ADHD? Oh, he was such a terror in class today. I tried calling his parents, but they don't care. Hey, are you going to finish that Danish? School official may also include contractors, volunteers, or other parties the school has outsourced work to, provided the following conditions are met. Number 1, a school official must be performing an educational function that the school would otherwise use its employees for. Number 2, you must maintain direct control over the personally identifiable information. This includes even when it's in the third party's possession. This may mean reserving the right to have the data changed, audited, or expunged at your request. And number 3, the school official may not redisclose that PII to any other individuals or organizations. In short, you make the rules for what they can do with the data, not the other way around. If they're serving an educational function, you have direct control, and they don't redisclose the data, then they're a school official. And there you have it, the 4 main exceptions to sharing student PII without parental consent. Now remember, this isn't an exhaustive list of all of the exceptions, so you should look into the other ones as well. I wanted to tell you about the other exceptions, but it's really cold. You'll also want to stay up to date with changes to federal and state law because it might affect how these exceptions work. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some other business to attend to.
I love this. that's a highly entertaining way to learn about FERPA, certainly better than what I got when I was learning about it. But so we went over a bunch of them. The main one, what we're going to talk about in terms of this, is the school official exception. So I'll skip over some of the rest of these things, but basically the most important thing that you should understand is direct control. So do you guys know the FPCO, the Family Policy Compliance Office? That's with the U.S. Department of Education. If you screw up about FERPA, those are the guys who are going to yell at you, basically. They have stated that direct control means that you have the necessary legal provisions governing access, use, and protection of PII. So the best, easiest way to deal with that is to have a contract in place. I include a specific statement that says, you are my school official, and then I make sure that that contract has that direct control. Pretty easy, actually. The one important thing to note is that they have to be performing a service that an individual at the school would otherwise perform. Now, this doesn't have to be direct one-for-one. So you can have a school official who provides assessments. Now, your staff can probably not do all the various things that your assessment vendors can do, and that's fine. But they're providing a service that a school employee would otherwise do if they had all those skills and all that technology and all those staff. The reason why I point that out is that USBE, Colorado Department of Education, we can't use this exception. So we're not school, we're not a staff, we don't have school staff, so we have to use a different one. Not necessarily something you guys have to worry about, but it's just a key thing to note, especially for you. So, any questions about that? About FERPA in general? Good time to ask if you have any questions that have come up. No? Okay. We're still on general provisions. These don't relate to any specific topic, but are just important things to cover. We want to make sure that we retain ownership of all the stuff we send you, including the PII. Now, this is a little bit different with you guys because if you think about it logically, the student or the student's parent are the one who actually own that student's PII. This does not supersede that in any way. But you are essentially entering into this contract on the student's behalf and on the parent's behalf. So basically what you want to do is you want to retain the ownership because the worst thing that can happen is that the vendor thinks that they own the data. They never own the data. You own the data. And you're doing that on the parent's behalf. Make sense? Another requirement is that everybody should comply with the law. Now, you don't have to state this in the contract for it to be true. A contract cannot contract around the law. So basically, you can't have a provision in your contract saying, oh, that FERPA thing, you don't have to worry about it. Don't worry about complying with it. It's not possible, not legal, nobody's going to win. But it is good to identify the most important laws that this vendor will have to comply with. So even educational apps and services may not really understand a lot of the educational laws. They may not really understand FERPA. They probably won't understand Utah's laws because they're providing services to the entire nation. So you might want to call out those ones that are most important. You can throw things like IDEA in there if it's related to specialized students, or HIPAA if it's related to health, although HIPAA doesn't really relate to schools. This is up to you to put whatever it is that you want in there. Even if it's not listed in here, they still have to comply with it, but I would always include the term or the language included but not limited to the following laws. That way you can make it very clear that that vendor doesn't have to just comply with those ones that you list. But again, you want to make sure that your vendors comply with the law. And the easiest way to do that is to say, here's what you really need to look at. You need to educate yourself on these laws and follow them. Easy peasy. Make sense? All right. Okay. Usually don't have these many technical difficulties, I swear. It's just special today. All right, well, I'm going to have to fiddle with this. How about a break? Let's do about 5 or 6 minutes, so come back around 10:10 or 10:15. Bathrooms are out in the hall. Oh, is it? Mm-hmm, probably.
Several grants through Utah State University.
Mm-hmm.
They subcontract with other organizations.
Uh-huh.
Do we need to be a part of that agreement?
It's kind of up to you. I don't need to advertise this to the entire group. I would recommend at least making sure that they're following about the same privacy protections. You can go above that if you would like to. You can say, I need to see your subcontractor agreements. Or you need to make sure that this flows down contractually to your third parties. Or you can just trust that they'll do the right thing. I mean, it's kind of up to you to figure out how much you want to control it.
And we've had, some of our grant partners, they will send us their own contract that describes the relationship and the data sharing and all that. Others don't, and it's kind of interesting. It doesn't seem like there's, like Utah State does not really have something in place, but Utah Education Policy Center does. I think we just need to realize we can't rely on them to do that. But if their contract seems adequate, we don't need to develop our own.
I like always using my own paper. Because it's easier for me, right? I can certainly use their contract terms as long as it meets my needs. We can come to an accord where we're kind of working together on it collaboratively. But as long as it covers your needs, it's really up to you how much. The problem is with somebody else's contract, you have to review it from top to bottom,
Right.
whereas you already know what your contracts say.
So if it's a federal or state grant program, then does that fall under number 1, the evaluator audit?
Most likely,
Okay.
yeah, because it's a evaluation of a federal state program.
Now, number 2, if we went to contract separately with UEPC to do a study on an educational program that we have, that'd be 2, the studies.
Probably. Yeah. The thing about FERPA exceptions is they're both broad and specific, and FERPA was drafted in 1972, not in 1974. So it's really out of date, and none of the exceptions are really going to work perfectly for everything. do the best that you can. If you're protecting the data as it's flowing out and you're doing generally the right things, that's what's most important. So, yeah, do what works best for you. Fit into one exception or another, but there probably is never going to be one that works perfectly for every situation.
And school official, that category, that would apply to volunteers who are coming in to help with student.
Yeah. And what I did is I put together sort of a contract template for USBE that they'll probably share. I don't know if they will or not, but that's for like independent contractors. You probably need to, and it's much shorter and to the point. You probably need even something smaller and less detailed
We have
for
something
your
fairly
volunteers.
simple for our volunteers. But,
Yeah,
okay.
where it just says basically you're going to do what we tell you to do with the data. You now have established direct control over that individual. So,
Okay. All right. Thank
hey,
you.
no worries. I know my connection's not private. I don't care.
Isn't it so hard not to hit the exit to go all the way out? I think it's what I know.
Well, and
not a big
yeah,
deal.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, we're totally cool. So.
No, I've done it a million times. Think you got right in the middle of, I do it all the time. You think that you're just exiting out of your thing, and I exit out the whole thing.
No, we're good, and we probably needed a break anyway. So people need to walk around and reactivate their brains.
And it was like, end of the day, and someone spilled their soda. One of the officers was having drinks on there, but the first guy was like, fell, and he spilled his soda. And I went to go tell the 12-year-old, and then I just and it, like, I fell, like, before I fell forward, it hurt my knee too. But yeah, I slipped and I fell, like, directly. You could, like, I don't think so. And then the other time, and it was yesterday, the day before that, and, we looked it up, but the only way we could tell is if we went and got x-rays, and I was like, well, it's better. Yeah, we're starting to get better. Yeah. So, yeah, trying to get I couldn't sit like this straight, and like my stomach, and like stuff in front of me.
All right, let's go ahead and get moving again. Finally figured out the whole technical thing, at least for 5 minutes. Since we're all chatting, any questions about all the stuff that I've gone through? I go really fast, so feel free to interrupt me and say, Jill, slow down, really. Seriously.
Are you going to send these out?
Yes.
Very, very soon, actually. So if you sign that sign-in sheet and wrote legibly, you're going to be emailed something in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah.
If you don't get it, talk to me after. And I'll
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
At some point, can you share some stories with when you had to enforce these contracts in your vendor?
Yes. Although, to be honest, most things have never ever really gone really, really wrong with my language. I think I've had maybe 2 or 3 completely failed negotiations where both parties just walk away. The rest of them we've been able to come to an accord. I haven't had a vendor breach that's all that serious. So I'll share the few stories that I have and how we kind of resolve those. But for the most part, it's gone really, really well. So that's good. I'll save those for the end so we can get through and leave on a fun note, if not exactly light. Okay, so Utah law requires you to have audit rights over your vendors. And this is one of those sections where I tell you the opposite of making things specific. This is where you want to make things as broad as possible. You never know what's going to go wrong with a particular vendor. You don't know if it's going to be a data breach, or if they just don't provide the services you need, or if something else goes wrong. So you want to retain as much and as broad of audit rights as you can possibly do. So this is language that we've put together. Either you or your designated representatives, you may want to hire a third-party company to audit all your vendors if you suddenly have all this money to play around with. Probably never happen, but you might. They need to perform an assessment, audit, examination, or review of all contractor sites and environments in order to confirm contractor's compliance with the contract itself, associated contractors or scopes of work, and applicable laws, regulations. This does not mean that you have to go audit all your vendors. This does not mean that you have to go on site and look at their servers. It just means that you're going to do something at some point. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I have no money, no staff, and no resources. Strange, right, in education. So I can't even audit if I want to be honest. But I can do little things. Like, I can maybe ask my vendors for all their subcontractor agreements to make sure that they're flowing down contractually all the requirements. Or if I've stopped working with a vendor, I can say, please confirm to me that you have deleted all the data and when you deleted it. That is essentially an evaluation or an audit of my vendors. And it didn't require like huge amount of effort, huge amount of work or money. So there's ways in which to do this to just double check that your vendors are doing the right thing without breaking the bank. So Utah law requires you to delete information immediately. Now, most likely this is not going to be, please delete all of our information. This is probably going to be related to a particular student. So, for example, a parent says, you must absolutely delete all of my child's data. That can get complicated, so you need to evaluate whether or not you can do that. But you want to be able to make sure that if you need to delete data for a particular reason, you can do so. And it usually needs to be done quite immediately. So the one thing you'll notice in here is that I put in a lot of dates. I want you to do it quickly, but I don't want to have to rely on what you interpret that to be. So a lot of contracts will say within a reasonable period or immediately. Who even knows what those words mean? For me, immediately is in 30 seconds. For you, it might be 3 minutes. It could be 3 weeks. I don't want to have to discuss that or to be in disagreement with my vendors about that. So I say within 5 calendar days. Now, the calendar is very important. You need to define if it can go on a business day or if it needs to happen in business days or calendar days. That is up to you, and it'll get more important when we talk about incident notification. But here, I want it to be done quickly, but it doesn't have to be done like today. Again, I also want to know how they're destroying the data. So again, this is where NIST or that definition will come into play too. Indemnification. Now, I'm not a lawyer again. I don't really understand all the ins and outs of this. I do understand the basics enough to be completely dangerous. You want them to identify you. If the vendor refuses to identify you for actions that they take, that's a big warning sign. I don't want them to identify me, which is basically means that, if things go really, really wrong and we end up at court, they're going to have to assist us with that whole process. I don't want them to identify me for everything, just the stuff that they or their subcontractors call us. So if they have a data breach and the parents end up suing me, which is complicated, but anyway, I want to make sure that they're not going to disappear into the woodwork. Now, if you are a government agency that's covered by the Governmental Immunity Act, you can't indemnify people. That's fine. You're covered by other protections. So I have one for if you're negotiating with a state agency and one for everybody else. So, for example, if you're doing business with a university, for example, they probably can't indemnify you. So they still have to help you in case something goes wrong, but this works around that Governmental Immunity Act. But this is something probably much better to discuss with your legal people. Okay? Breach insurance. So breaches are bad, and they can get really, really, really bad. Most likely, you'll never have a major data breach. But if you do, it can get expensive. I think the last time I looked, Ponemon Institute does a cost of a data breach survey every year. Basically, they calculate how much data breach is going to cost an organization. And they break it out by countries, they break it out by industries. I think government agencies in education was $72 per record. So if you combine that by how many students you have, that can get pretty expensive. Or it cannot be. But either way, you want to make sure that if a breach happens and it's caused by your vendor or by one of their subcontractors, that they have the ability to pay for that. Now, you're doing business probably, some of these companies might be really, really small, and they may not have the resources to handle a data breach. If they go bankrupt because of this data breach, and it has happened, you don't want to be left holding the bag. Breach insurance will help you with that. It's kind of a newer thing. It's not every carrier will have it. It could be kind of expensive, but again, it's much less expensive than a data breach. And it's a very, very good thing. It shows that your vendors are being proactive and that they're being responsible. Now, you may not require this of all your vendors. You may want to require it only for those vendors that have either really sensitive PI, health information, special ed education information, or like your SIS vendors who handle all your information. It's totally up to you to determine what your policies are going to be around insurance. I suggest applying it as broadly as you can get away with, frankly. If a vendor pushes back and they're like, listen, we only have the student name, and it's not really that big of a deal if it gets breached. I kind of agree, actually. So I might waive it, but I'd prefer to leave it in as much as possible. So now the templates that you'll see, this is just the top part of it. The contracts that you'll see has a long section on insurance. It has the requirements for this type of insurance, breach insurance, but also other things. Vehicle insurance if they're using a car to provide you with services, a few other things. And it also has requirements for how up to date they have to keep that insurance. Like they can't just let it lapse after they sign the contract. And there's also requirements for them to provide that information to me, sort of a proof of insurance, and their subcontractors have to provide that insurance to me. So basically, they need to get all that information from their subcontractors and send it all to me within 30 days, I think, of the signing of the contract. Again, If you don't want to go that hardcore after a small vendor that only has very limited PI, it's totally up to you. But you'll have the most stringent in the template, and then you can scale it back. Make sense? Okay. So we were talking about, when we talked about the authorized representative definition, or authorized persons, sorry, that they're going to have requirements. This is where they come into play. The biggest thing that causes data breach is human error. It just happens. We all do dumb things. I do a dumb thing once a day, practically. So it just is going to happen. The best way to avoid most of the dumb things is to let people know exactly what they should and should not do. The best way for you to control your vendor's staff and make sure that they're doing the right thing is to make sure that they sign some sort of agreement. Now, this can be called a whole bunch of different things. A non-disclosure agreement, a use agreement, standard practices agreement. I mean, there's a lot of different things that they could be called. But basically, you want to make sure that your vendor is telling their staff what to do and what not to do. You want to make sure that that's done, too, before they have access to PII. So I really want my vendors to know exactly who's going to have access to data. And we'll get into some of the more of those in a second. And they need to be informing of those vendors, or those staff, of what they need to do. The staff will have to sign something. I want them to understand that this is some sort of contractual agreement. They're going to be held to it. And then, if I ask for them, you need to provide them to me. Now, I probably will never ask for them unless I suspect a vendor of doing something really, really wrong. In which case, I reserve this right. I may never have to pull it, but it's there if I need it. And that means that they'll have to send me a list of all those authorized persons and a copy of the contract, or the NDA. Now, the other reason why I put this in here, not just because I might want to actually look at them at some point, is because if I put in a requirement that they'll have to provide it to me upon request, it makes it a little bit more likely that the vendors will actually do it. A lot of times vendors will just sign whatever you put in front of them. They'll look at these things and they'll say, okay, yes, I can comply with it. But they may not actually have the resources to do it. They might think about doing it, but not actually be the persons who would actually do it. There's a lot of reasons why things don't get done. This makes it a little bit more likely that they'll do it. Make sense? So, access controls. Again, I want to make sure that the vendor has thought through who needs to see the data I'm giving them, why they need to see it. I need them to do all the necessary things to grant that access, to revoke that access. And they need to maintain some sort of audit trail. Now, again, this may need to be provided to me, but most likely I'm never going to audit this unless you have a breach. This is very, very important in the case of a breach. Say, for example, some staff member at your contractor's office downloaded a malware that locked down all their computers and stole all the data and encrypted it. You want that vendor to know how that happened in order to prevent it happening again. So if they know who downloaded that malware, that's very, very important. If it turns out that that person didn't even need access to that data, I'm going to start getting really angry. So again, keeping this stuff very well tracked is very, very important. The other thing that is almost always overlooked in almost every organization is the deprovisioning of access. So when a staff member moves to another department, they probably don't need the same access to the same data. When they leave the organization, they don't need access to the data anymore. But a lot of times people forget to turn off that access. It is probably the one thing that is easy to do that nobody does. So make sure that they terminate access once the employee no longer needs it. Make sure that they comb their systems occasionally to find inactive accounts. If somebody hasn't accessed the data for 6 months, they probably don't need it, and their access should be shut off. This is also something that's good to do in your own organization. Usually it might already happen that you may not even know. Active Directory accounts and all that kind of stuff is used directly for this, to make sure that the people have access to only what they need to have access to, and it's turned off when they no longer need it. One other thing about this, just between us, this is very, very, very important if you're firing somebody. Turn it off before you fire them, at least as quickly as you can. So many breaches happen because a disgruntled employee stole all the data. So do that. It's really important. It's just a really good practice to do.
And we're finding that access to the data gateway is always turned off after employees leave at the LEA level. And that's probably important. We've found folks that have levels of state, not state, but LEA level access in large districts that haven't been working there for a couple months. They've been locked out of their accounts. They don't necessarily access the data because they're decent people, but imagine if you were upset. So make sure you turn that off as well.
Yeah. And you don't necessarily have to completely deactivate them or remove them from the system, especially if they're just employees moving from department to department. But you at least want to terminate their access credentials. So when they try to log in, their password won't work. That's important. Make sense? Questions? Okay. Training. As I said again, human error leads to almost all of them. We're just dumb. We're just dumb. And that's not anything that's bad, but the easiest way to prevent that, aside from giving people the right access and monitoring it, is to provide them with training. Tell people what they need to do. Let them know what should and should not happen. Do it often. I recommend mandatory, means your access will be cut off if you don't do it, at least on a yearly basis. At the start of when they're hired and annually ever after that. And I require that of my vendors too, because they're just as likely to have an oops as I am. Again, maintaining a list is important. It means that they're doing it consistently and across the board. I want them to do it annually. I want it to be mandatory. And I want to get that list if I ask for it. Again, I probably won't ever, but it'll make it a little bit more likely that they'll do it. Make sense? Okay, so we're going to switch tacks a little bit. We all talked about access. Basically, only if you have a need to know, only for authorized legitimate educational purposes, and legitimate. Like, I need to make sure that if you have access, you still then need that access, and that you're using it for the right purpose. But now we're going to talk about the uses of it. And this is probably more related to the entire organization of your vendor and less to individual staff. So this is required by both Utah law and FERPA. I noticed that some contracts basically state this first part. Contractors shall not collect, use, or share PI beyond the purposes stated in this contract. But a lot of times the purposes aren't really stated in the contract, or they're stated at such a high level that it's pretty unclear. So for example, I'm giving data to an assessment vendor. They're going to do the assessments and all that kind of stuff, but they also want to take the data and use it to determine if a student is being prejudiced against because of how the test is written. So for example, the test somehow has some sort of prejudice against certain students. They want to make sure that they don't have that. I'm actually pretty okay with that. I kind of don't want that either. But I want to know if they're doing that. Sometimes I'm going to say, you can't use PI for that. You have to use de-identified data. But again, I want to know exactly what you're doing with the data, everything. So sometimes I just refer to the statement of work. You guys know what a statement of work is? It's basically you telling the vendor step by step what exactly they're going to provide to you. These can be quite detailed. They should be pretty detailed. And it basically states all the purposes for use. So a lot of times you don't have to have a separate section in the contract for this. It's already in your statement of work or scope of work. But you should refer to that and say you can only use it for these purposes. If there's something that is not listed in that statement of work, I have them write it in. Now this is one of those sections where it causes a lot of conversations that we weren't already going to have. Vendors, they're not always evil, but sometimes they do things that they may not want to disclose to everybody. They may market to students. They may use it for testing purposes. I want to know everything that they're going to do with our data, period. A lot of times you'll find that all of a sudden you're finding out things that you didn't even know the vendor was doing. So this is a great way to start those conversations because they may not otherwise disclose that information to you. And in that example I showed you before, I'm not sure I'll disagree with what you're doing. I may think it's fine, but I want to know about it. We need to have that discussion. So now, similarly, also required, you need to list out the sharing of data and how that's going to happen and why it's going to happen. So I do pretty much the same thing. I say, if you're going to share data with another party, you have to tell me about it. You have to tell me why. So for example, if an assessment vendor shares data with a learning vendor who provides additional coursework to help kids pass the SATs, for example, I want to know that they're sharing that data with them. I don't care if it's not related to PII. I just want to know what they're doing with the PII and how they're sharing that data. So in some cases, depending on the vendors, I list out in the contract, we will be sharing it with Khan Academy for these purposes. We will be sharing it with this subcontractor for these purposes.
Sorry, what if they change it to de-identified? If the vendor wants to say that it's de-identified data, because that's what I'm finding a lot.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I generally prefer a lot of those processes to use only de-identified data. If you want to use it for system testing, great, de-identify it. But where that gets tricky is whether or not you agree to what de-identification actually means. Some vendors are like, well, we stripped off the names, so it's not identifiable. But we list out every single demographic that you collect on these kids. So we know exactly who that kid is, just by piecing together the information. I tend to be pretty strict on this, and we'll get into a section where I actually have my requirements for de-identification. In some cases, depending on the vendor and how squirrely I think they are, I will list out you can use de-identified data for this purpose. You can use PII for this purpose. So, good question. Anything else on this? So now there's certain things that you can and cannot do with the data. Targeted advertising. As I mentioned before, there are some ways in which you can advertise targetedly. I have no idea if that's the right way. I'm having issues with words today. In which case, I actually list out the things that they can and cannot do. Just to avoid the confusion, just to make it very clear, those little dots mean that there's more in the templates than what's written on the screen. So I just list that all out. Selling data. I don't know who in the world went around selling all this student PII, because every single law I've read has a prohibition against it, and I've never met anybody who has any interest in selling data. Seriously. It's like, I don't know. Anyway, maybe, Well, don't even get me started on that. They license it. Anyway, yeah, so anyway, just make sure that this is in your contracts to make sure. Hi.
I'm going to throw this out here. So actually, data is a really hot item.
Is it?
For people, yes, because of the fact that they have no credit history.
Mm.
And because of the fact that it will take years before anyone figures out that someone has their name and other information and have created it. They don't even need their social sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be really careful because there are people that aren't targeting school districts, and it's more like whichever school district has the best security in place is the one that doesn't get hit the hardest. But if you're the weak link, then you're going to be a repeated target.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. I tend to believe the best of people, which is probably pretty naive of me. That is a very, very good point. That's why don't collect SSNs if you don't have to. Be very careful about birth dates. I don't share birth dates unless I absolutely have to, because that's one more piece of the puzzle. I share only what is specifically needed for the purpose, and I try to keep everything else really locked down. But you're right that there is people who try to market off of student data. Most likely they'll go after your educator data first, most likely because you will have educator SSNs, or they'll go after your payroll. We've had 2 data breaches in Colorado. Both of them they used targeted phishing for the routing codes to our payroll. So they basically changed those and had 3 or 4 months worth of employee payroll sent to their bank accounts. So there's a lot of different ways that people will try to misuse this information, but it's usually always for a monetary gain. The one thing that is allowed is if a company gets bought out by another company or they merge, that is permitted, but you need to make sure that all parties continue to be held by this agreement. Most likely what you'll do is like an assignment letter where you assign the obligations under that contract to the new entity, but I like to put in a specific section on that too. Just basically says, you may be a new company, but you still have to comply with my requirements. Make sense? Okay. So now we're going to get into security. So I saw that there was a few tech people, so this may be really elementary to some of you guys, but I like to put it out there. It's very, very important to make sure that they're following the right security practices, and these differ a lot. Even within the Colorado state agencies, we have very, very different understandings of how PII needs to be protected. They put us kind of down here on the low risk. I want to be up here in the high risk. So even in the case of me sharing it with another state agency, I need to make sure that the security requirements in our contracts are sufficient to my standards, not necessarily to theirs. This is just a first general statement. It's basically talking about we all want to handle the data correctly. We want to do the best thing. We want to make sure that there's no inappropriate or unauthorized use of PII. And we want to make sure that we retain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of PII. So you guys, IT people, information security people will understand the CIA triad. It's not the spies. It's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It basically means that these are the things you need to do to protect data. Confidentiality. There's a term called least privilege. It means that you are given access to the least amount of information you need to do your job. And you give that access to the least amount of people that need to do that job. Integrity. Just making sure that data is not tampered with or changed. This is also important when we're talking about non-personally identifiable information. If you're relying on data to make decisions, you want to make sure that it hasn't been altered or corrupted in some way. And availability. You want to make sure it's available when you need it. And it's available to the right people. Okay? Make sense? Again, high standards. So I have high standards, and I'm a tough negotiator. I expect you to follow my instructions, and I'm going to tell you exactly what I need you to do, and I need a very good reason why you're not. I don't always use this language. Basically, you're telling the vendor to maintain the methods that are at least as good or better than established by your policies. This can get problematic, and this is one area where I almost always have to have a pretty in-depth conversation with my vendors. So, as I mentioned before, or maybe I didn't, we have different standards of security than the rest of the state agencies, but we're somewhat governed by their IT policies. I have a section in our contract that says you must comply with the state of Colorado's IT policies, but you have to use the high categorization of data, not the low one. It raises the level of security requirements way higher into my standards. The problem with inserting policies into your contracts, it's good because you can never list all your security requirements in a contract. IT policies are like billions of pages. So it's a good, quick reference to what all those standards will be. However, vendors don't like it. And I almost always never agree to this. I want you to list everything I'm responsible for doing in the contract itself. If you insist on having a policy that you want me to follow, I either attach it, most likely I will attach it to the actual contract, or if you want to provide me with a link with it, I want to make sure that the version I am reading today is the version that I have to follow forever. So, you can insert a hyperlink to where all your policies are stored, but I'm going to insert a version number. Or I'm going to say that these are policies as drafted on this date. Because I don't want you to hold me to standards I don't understand, that I don't know about, and I haven't agreed to. So you're more than welcome to do this. It's a really quick shortcut, but just be advised that most vendors will push back on it, and you'll have to work with them on that. It's not a bad thing, but they're just trying to protect them as well. If you don't have policies, or if they're not great, or if they're old, you don't have to do this at all. You can just insert the standards that you want them to follow in the contract itself. Make sense? Okay. So I'm going to go through a lot of these security requirements. This is just some of them. You might want to add other ones. They're a little vague because technology evolves faster than our contracts. So I want them to set a bottom level. If you want to exceed it, great. I'm so thrilled. But I don't want it to be so specific as to be completely out of date tomorrow. So if you have your policies and the policies cover this stuff, you probably don't need to insert these. So it's really important for you to understand as an organization what security requirements you want, what is most important for you to tell your vendors, and how's the best way for them to get that information. Transmission of PII always has to be encrypted, period. I don't want to hear stories about why that's not possible. There's no reason in this world why a transmission of PII shouldn't be encrypted. There's a billion ways to do it. So, at the very minimum, transmission. I also want encryption at rest. I want your databases to be encrypted. I want your laptops to be encrypted. I want any media that you store my PII on to be encrypted. It's easy. So do it. Maintaining and storing PII only in the United States. This is definitely a best practice, but it's really complicated nowadays in this world. The huge amount of use of cloud providers means even if you are the best IT shop in the world, you have the best security, you may not really know where your data is being held. You can know that it's secure wherever it is, but you may not know where those cloud servers are being stored. This is kind of an archaic term. It may need to evolve as we get further along in our technology, but I would rather not have you use data centers, if you're using data centers, in some third world country. Nothing against that country, but it could be that the reason why they're using that country is because the costs are low, and usually the reason why the costs are low is because security is not great. You also will have problems with jurisdiction if something really bad happens. It may be hard for you to resolve an issue legally if it's in another country. And in fact, I think the Supreme Court is talking about this now with Microsoft, about who owns the data and how a company or an individual will get access to that data. Do they need to go to France and ask the French authorities for that information? There's reasons why they should, reasons why they shouldn't. So I start with this. If the vendor says, well, I use AWS and I don't know where the data is, I might say, okay, we're going to talk about the protections you have for data using AWS, but we can negotiate that. Okay? As I mentioned before, everything should be encrypted everywhere it goes. We travel. We work in a lot of different places. We may even travel from building to building. That's totally fine. This is a mobile world we live in. But if you're putting PII on anything, it needs to be encrypted. So my laptop here, I don't even have access to PII, but my laptop's encrypted. I occasionally will use a thumb drive that's encrypted. The most important thing that you need to know is, remember when we were talking about the difference between an incident and a breach? The best way to keep things as an incident and not have it be a breach is that you can say, well, yeah, their laptop was stolen, but it's encrypted. Boom. All of a sudden, you don't have a breach to deal with. That's a huge, huge thing, and it's really easy to do, and it's really easy to not do. So it's really important that when you're storing PII on any sort of mobile device, thumb drive, hard drive, external server, phone, it needs to be encrypted. And there's plenty of ways to do it. If I'm working remotely, I use a VPN for everything, frankly. It's the best way to do it. You guys know what a VPN is? Virtual private network. You basically log in and it encrypts everything that you send back and forth. If you're working at the airport, if you're working at your hotel, use a VPN. Just do it as a matter of practice. It's the best way to secure the information. Your information too, not just the information you're using. I use it for everything, even though I don't have access to student data. Because if I need to check my bank statement, I don't want to have to fuss with worrying about it. So I just do everything on the VPN if I'm on a public network. Starbucks, all of them. Okay? Backups. Backups have always been important, but now they're really, really important. The new trend is I'm going to forget the specific word for it, where the hackers access all your files, encrypt them, and sell you the keys. Or they at least offer to sell you the keys, but most likely they will never do that. You'll just send them a whole bunch of money and they'll disappear. The only way that this doesn't end as a catastrophe for your network is if you have a regular backup, usually daily. So you'll lose all the information from that day, but you can just go back to the prior day. This is happening a lot, and it's pretty likely that it'll happen to you. So make sure that all your information is backed up. But if you're backing up PII to another server, to another facility, to another hard drive, it needs to be encrypted. Make sense? Passwords. Passwords are the worst and the best. I mean, seriously, they're just... I used to put together statistics on how bad everybody's passwords were, but it just got really, really depressing. Don't use password. Don't use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Use complex passwords. There's a lot of debate about what is a good complex password. Some people think letters, numbers, and symbols, both capitalized and lowercase letters. That is good. What I've been reading recently is that the length is far more important. So one good technique to use is to use a passphrase. Instead of typing in a word or a combination of words and letters, write out an entire phrase. With each additional letter that you add to your password, it increases the time it takes to break it by like huge amount. So if you have something like a 12-digit password, it's something on the lines of like 2 million years or something that it'll take to break it via a computer. So it's important. It's important for your internal organization, and it's important for you, and it's important for your vendors. Now, I don't tell them exactly what they do unless they ask. I don't say you have to use a 15-digit password with numbers, letters, and symbols and other stuff. But I do say that they have to have a strong password because I want them to evolve it over time. Make sense? Okay. Also, don't share passwords and don't use administrative accounts that are shared by more than one person, even if the information that you're sharing isn't sensitive. So, for example, we have a SurveyMonkey account at my organization, and I hate it because it has one password for the entire organization. Now, we say specifically, you cannot use this system for PII at all, period. But I still don't like it because if something happens to an individual user and we can't figure out which user that was, it makes it very hard to figure out what happened in the case of a breach. So generally, each individual should have their own password, their own login credentials, and you should audit that carefully. Okay? Intrusion protection. So, pen testing, vulnerable testing, all that kind of stuff. It's basically you test your environment a couple of times a year or once a year to make sure that you don't have any big gaping hackable holes. I want that to be annual or more often than that. And then I also specifically state that they have to remediate all identified issues. Now that sometimes is kind of a gap that a lot of people miss, is that they're really good at testing their systems, but they don't necessarily get to the remediation all that quickly. I want it to be very quickly. Now, I do have in here a timely manner. I generally don't use those kind of descriptors in my contracts. If I need it to be done in a certain time, I want to tell you exactly how long that time is. But this is one where the different kinds of vulnerabilities could be so broad and take such a different amount of time to fix. It's really hard to be more specific. So I do put timely. If there's a case of an issue happening, we'll have to deal with it at that time. But for the most part, I want to make sure it's being done quickly. Okay? And then you need to have antivirus and anti-malware software. And you need to keep it very up to date. And you need to resolve any issues that are identified. This is something everyone should do. Seriously, if your vendors push back on this, they might push back on the pen testing. They may say, well, we do it every other year. I generally try to push back as hard as I can. Depending on the sensitivity of the data, I may say, okay, every 2 years is fine. But generally, they should do it at some point. Because if you don't know what your vulnerabilities are, you might as well have no security protections at all. And the same thing with antivirus. I mean, at this point, there's no excuse for not having antivirus or anti-malware software on your computers, period. Now, I don't know how long your contracts tend to be, how long the term is. Some of our schools use 5 years. So every 5 years, they renegotiate the contract. We use every year at the very minimum. I recommend a shorter period because things change. And 5 years is a long time. If you find out that your vendor is really, really terrible in that first year, you still have 5 years left to go. And we'll get into termination rights and stuff like that. But basically, you don't want to have that long period of time to address any gaps or vulnerabilities in your contract. So, do that quickly. But even if you do it on a yearly basis, things change. Vendors, hopefully, are constantly making improvements to their systems. They're improving the functionality, they're improving the security provisions, they're improving a lot of things. And that's a great thing. I am fully in support of that. But I want to know if any of those changes that you're making are going to negatively affect the confidentiality and the security of the data that I've sent you. I don't need to know if you're increasing your encryption algorithms. That's great. We're all happy about that. But if it's going to reduce it, or if you are removing some of your processes and procedures, you need to notify me. You need to notify me before you do it, and I need to make a decision about whether or not I still want you to be my vendor. So that's pretty important. But it doesn't have to be everything. It can be material changes. It can be negative changes. You don't want to be bugged for every single thing, but you do want to be bugged if it's something bad. All right, incidents. This is where things get fun for people who are not everybody else but me. Okay, so as I mentioned before, my definition of incidents is very broad. I want you to notify me, even if you think that something might have happened. I don't want you to prove that it's happened before you tell me. I don't want you to even figure out what exactly happened before you tell me. You have 1 calendar day. Sometimes, just to be very specific, I change this to 24 hours. It has to be within 24 hours of you finding out something has happened. You have to be on the phone with me, period. You don't have to tell me everything that happened. It is okay if you call me and say something's happened, we don't know what, we're investigating. That's all the conversation needs to be. But if I have to get my team ready to remediate a breach, I want to know immediately that I need to call those people in. I never agree to a longer time period. I never agree to business days. Never. Breaches almost always happen 5 p.m. on a Friday. I don't want people waiting till Monday to deal with it. Just no. I'm sorry, but in the case of an incident, that's kind of your job. You have to be available. And you sometimes are working them at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. It's just the way things are. So you need to notify me immediately. And you also have to cooperate with us. Sometimes you don't think you have to say that, but you might as well just say it anyway. I want to be in control. This is my data. I own it on behalf of my students and parents. So I'm going to make all the decisions when it comes to how we deal with it. If we need to involve law enforcement, I will make that decision. I may talk with the vendor about it, but a lot of that stuff needs to come from me. And at the very least, I'm going to be a party to making those decisions. Because things can get very, very complicated very, very fast. Remediation. So As I mentioned before, I want that initial phone call. I want it to come within 24 hours, but I don't need it to be detailed. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to need incredibly detailed information about what happened, why did it happen, how many students or educators were impacted, what kind of data was impacted. I'm going to want the whole rigmarole. I want it written. I want you to send me a report on what happened, and especially what you're going to fix it now and how you're going to keep it from happening in the future. So within 10 days after that first notice, you're going to send me a written remediation plan that includes all that information. Then we're going to discuss it. And we're going to make sure that it works for me. And if I need to make changes because I feel you're not doing your job, I'm going to make changes. So, this can sometimes cause some concern by vendors, but it's really what they need to do. It's very important that you have written documentation showing exactly what happened and how it's going to be fixed. Because if you have to talk to your parents or the media about what happened, and if it's a vendor that caused it, you want to know that you have all the facts. Don't talk to the media before you have all the facts. If you have to talk to them, you have to provide notice immediately. Just give them what you know and tell them, this is what we know today. We will get back to you tomorrow with more information. Don't start talking about things that you haven't 100% confirmed. But once you do have that all confirmed, and there's no reason why it should take longer than 10 days, you need to send me all that written information. Make sense? Okay. So, I include this little picture because we always talk about how we only audit if your headquarters are located in Hawaii. Because we have no resources to audit, but I sometimes get vendors who are confused about this. I allow for regular, I just need to check up on my vendors' audits to happen within reasonable times, during business hours, with no notice or with some notice. But in the case of an incident, I have the right to be on site with you. It's okay if you don't want me to interfere, although I will interfere if you're not doing it right. But I need to be there, and you need to allow me to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to help you deal with that incident and to make sure that my needs are being taken care of. I don't negotiate this. If you want me to do my regular audits at a regular time, sure, no problem. But in this case, I will be on your site, being very angry if you caused a major breach. Make sense? A lot of vendors will push back on this, but I'm sorry. No. Most likely, you'll never have to pull this trigger. You'll never have to go to a site, again, unless they're located in Hawaii. But you want to have the right to do so if you need to. Costs, liability. You want to make sure that if they cause it, they pay for it. Now, this language may have to change if they're a government entity and they can't indemnify you. There's indemnification language in here. You can remove it. I usually remove like the middle paragraphs, middle sentence in that paragraph. But again, it's up to you to create what language works for you. I only remove it if I get pushback. The other thing I want them to do, so this talks about lawsuits and when the lawyers get involved and who has to pay for that. However, we currently have no notification requirements in law. We are not technically required to notify any parent or student of a data breach. That doesn't mean that we don't want to. We are here to provide services to students. If we've done something bad, I want to let them know. But that may not be supported by law. It may just be our decision. If we make that decision, and it's going to cost a lot of money to deal with those notifications, I want the vendor to pay for it if they caused it. So I usually have a separate section just for that. So you'll have to think about that. Despite what most people think, that can probably be the most costly thing that you will do in terms of a data breach. Even if you don't have parent information and you're notifying parents, you probably still have to set up a helpline, some sort of place for them to get more information. I've been involved in 1 or 2 serious data breaches, not where I currently am, but in other places. And we had to hire a vendor that did a 24-hour helpline, mailing out to all the affected parties, handling all the calls. They would turn the more serious calls over to us, and we'd have to get on the call and listen to them yell at us. And it took like about 3 months of everybody dropping everything to work on the breach. So making sure you get some of that cost reimbursed is the difference between handling a breach correctly and just having it snowball into hell. All right. Are we still ready to go? We're almost done, I promise. And I'll quit talking at you. End of agreement. So there's very, very few things that you need to do. But once you terminate the agreement, certain things do have to happen. So law requires you or your vendors to delete all the information that they have when they're at the end of the contract. I use the word destroy, but it's essentially the same thing. However, if I've sent vendor data to you and you've done stuff with it, collected more from the students, done assessments, I want to have everything that you've accumulated over the life of our relationship. So you need to provide me with a secure and complete download of all the information that you have. Send it to me. I usually like this all to happen within 30 days after the termination of the agreement. Once I have either said, no, I don't want to download, I don't need one, or once I have said, yes, this download that you provided me is great, and it contains everything I need, we're all good. After that, I want you to destroy the data. And then you're going to send me a little letter that says you've destroyed it and what data you destroyed it on. Pretty straightforward. Another easy thing to audit, and something I have yet to get to with my vendors. So it is important for you not only to have this in your contracts, but to follow up with it once you're done. All right. So a lot of information, a lot of fast information, a lot of details. Here's the key points. We're going to provide you guys with a menu. We're going to provide you with a template. Use it as a reference. Make it your own. This has to work for you. If you're the one who negotiates these agreements, you want to know exactly what's in there and be comfortable with it. Always plan for the worst scenario you can think of. You won't be able to think of everything, but think about what happens when things go wrong and what you'll need the vendor to do for you when things go wrong. If you are not particularly legal-minded, but you still have the responsibility for negotiating contracts or reading contracts from your vendors, ask. I think a lot of people don't feel comfortable with asking. I've been doing this for 12 years, and I still get on the phone sometimes and say, I don't understand what you're even saying in this section. Please explain it to me. Tell me what you mean by this. Because sometimes things are written not that most opaquely or transparently. Sometimes things are confusing. Some things don't make sense to me, but make sense to them. So we need to have that discussion. And if they can't explain it to me, I won't agree to it. And then have sort of a resource of common negotiated terms. So if you've negotiated 3 or 4 agreements and you realize that almost all your vendors are pushing back on this one thing, and you've kind of agreed to this one other section that kind of covers you, keep a list of those. You'll remember it, but most likely the people that come after you won't. So it's great to have a menu of all the possible terms you'll agree to. We'll provide you with the start of that, but add to it as you adjust your contracts.
We emailed it out to everyone.
Okay, you already have it.
I think it's a 23-page menu.
It's daunting, but a lot of what I've covered is already in there. That's for you to back up. That's for you to reference later. but we've already discussed a lot of it. Okay? So, let's see. How many of you guys use Infinite Campus? Oh, good. That's awesome. Because I'm going to say terrible things about them right now. No. Yes, for a few examples of when things went wrong or things didn't go great. We have our facility schools, which are like our mental health facilities, criminal facilities, and stuff like that. It's one of the few areas where we actually have direct contact with students at the SCA. So we have a SIS vendor for those students. Because of who these kids are, that information is really sensitive. It's really, really sensitive. And I worry about it a lot. We purchase Infinite Campus through a third-party reseller, which it's just a mess. Software companies love it. Everybody else hates it. It makes everything very difficult. So we had a contract in place with these guys that includes all of our requirements. And when it came to renegotiating the contract the next year, it kind of seemed like they didn't read it the first time, because when we asked them to prove that they had done some of the things in the contract, they hadn't actually done them. Specifically, they didn't see the need to background check their employees. I insist on background checks, and they have to be current. Background checks at the data hire is great if that employee has been there for 30 days or a year. But if they've been there for 20 years, a lot of bad stuff can happen in 20 years. So they disclosed to us that they were not doing what we told them to do in the prior contract. I got very, very angry in a very polite way, but I was mad. So we went to renegotiate it in the contract and make sure that they actually did it, and then they flat out refused. And their general message was, walk away. We're not going to agree to this. We're not going to do it. You can go find another vendor. Now, background checks aren't required in our law. We're supposed to provide adequate security, and I think background checks are adequate security, but it wasn't specifically listed in our law. So we ended up taking this all the way up to the Commissioner of Education. We had a lot of discussions, and it turned out that the need for our facility school leaders to continue using this product overweighed the risk of background checks. Not necessarily how I would have gone, but again, that's not my job to make those hard kinds of decisions. So in the end, we took that out of our contract, and we let them go forward. So that's kind of how things go in the worst case. That's not going to happen with all of them, most likely. I think I've had that happen once, where we couldn't come to an agreement at all, and I had to give on something I want. But again, that's a good time for you to bring in your management and have them make those hard calls. Trying to think. We have had one vendor breach since I've been in this role. The issue was, I talked a lot about notification and how quickly you have to notify me. Vendors don't always do it. And sometimes they notify the wrong people. And sometimes those people don't do what they're supposed to do quite quickly. So in this case, the vendor notified their customer team, the program staff who uses that vendor. They didn't notify IT. It was fine. We found out about it late. And by the time we found out about it, and how we found out about it, is somebody sent an email to all of the applicable staff saying vendor breach in the subject line. I flipped I was not happy. And we're actually going to work on training about how not to do that. Try not to put stuff in writing, and please don't say the B word. Just don't. And don't put it in the subject line of an email, because it actually wasn't a breach. It turned out it was a minor incident. Some parents had access to the wrong student's information. We were able to control it. They immediately shut off access before even some of the parents knew it had happened. We remediated it, and then the program team told other unimpacted districts about it. They were just talking about it. Don't do that either. Not great. Tell the people who need to know and nobody else. Because the minute that they told other districts, the word got out and we had to notify our commissioner, we had to notify the state board, and everybody got angry. So again, making sure you do some of these things in the right way is very, very important, because the one thing that will happen in a data breach is that everybody will get upset. And the more that you can minimize it and control it, the better off you'll be. Okay? So, any other questions about any of this? War stories? Anything that's not clear? Any issues you've had in contracts that you want to run through? Anything at all? Do you want to go home? Yeah. We're actually finished up really quickly. I will be around for a little while if you want to talk to me one-on-one. Whitney and her team are fantastic and will be here to help you when I'm not. So please do reach out to them. Thanks. Thanks for coming.